Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf, and I'm the programming coordinator here at the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you so much for being here as well. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Captain Sean Meagher and Ace, this beautiful puppy, as he gives this exciting talk on exploring the unknown. Captain Sean Meagher was born and raised on Cape Cod. He was given his first sailboat at the age of 8 and has been sailing ever since. He earned his first captain's license at the age of 18. Shortly after was given his first command of a ferry boat going to Martha's Vineyard. Since then, he has piloted everything from search and rescue craft on the Colorado River to Oceano's 109-meter Bravo Eugenia. In 2014, he piloted the master yacht Latitude through the Northwest Passage, and in 2015, he did it again in the opposite direction, earning his first Boat International Voyager Award. Beyond yachting, Sean is a dedicated conservationist, actively involved with Ocean Voyages Institute in the fight against ocean plastics. He has spoken internationally on environmental sustainability and has documented plastic pollution in some of the most remote areas on Earth. Without further ado, Captain Sean Meagher.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Osterville Library. And for you guys in Zoom land, so pardon me for usually I would be getting up and walking around the podium. Actually, I'm going to step right over here. Forgot my pointer. But in order to look at you guys in the eye at home, I'm going to be standing right here. So I've talked. Again, I was telling you guys a little bit before we started to talk officially. I've talked on various subjects about my voyages. The Northwest Passage. Again, I was fortunate enough to go through the Northwest Passage in both directions in consecutive years. We were the third vessel in history ever to do that. We followed that up by going to the North Pole and punching. Actually, we circumnavigated Svalbard and punched within 500 miles of the North Pole. Now, what's significant about those voyages in particular is that I did it on a non-ice class vessel, and I did it with an untrained, unproven crew. And that's more of what I want to talk about today, and it's been at the crux of a lot of my talks, is that I've done these extraordinary things, but I haven't done them alone. And for some reason, my thing is not going forward. There we go. I've cruised all over the world. This is a picture that I took in Thailand. It was really where I think was the start of my yachting career, was in Southeast Asia. Again, thrown into a situation with crew that I hadn't met on a boat that I'd never been on. And we figured it out. I had a great engineer there, Kerry Sudgeon. It was right after the tsunami happened. We rushed there to get this boat that was on the hard, meaning it was in dry dock in Langkawi, and bring it into Thailand so we could make water for local villages. And I had never met Kerry, who was my engineer, and yet we had to work together, and we had to do it in a pinch, and we had to get to where we were going in order to provide critical water to the to remote areas of Thailand. And we did it. We didn't think twice about doing it. We just jumped in and did our jobs. One thing, though, is I left Kerry in charge of the provisioning for the vessel. And I went down, when we left the boat, left Malaysia, and we're off the coast of Malaysia heading to Thailand. I went down to get something to eat. And I said, "Where's the food?" And he was Australian. He says, "Oh, mate, it's on the counter." I said, "All I found was one case of creamy pumpkin soup." He goes, "Oh, yeah, mate, it's lovely." I go, "That's all the food you bought for us for the next week?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, mate, 2-3 cans a day, you're fine." But anyway, that was the beginning of my career. Probably one of the apex parts of my career. Again, was the voyage that I did on board Latitude through the Northwest Passage and eventually up into the North Pole. That's a picture of me on an island called Cavoit Island, which is maybe 50 people on the planet have been to that island. It's and if you notice, I'm carrying a big rifle because there are a ton of polar bears on that particular island. From there into the South Pacific. Well, there we go. From there into the South Pacific, that's a picture of me in the Solomon Islands when we were there visiting the Solomon Islands. But wherever we went, we tried to make the places a little bit better. Often we would bring medical supplies and educational supplies to really, really remote islands. Now, as I've said, you're only as good as the people that are around you. Shackleton is probably one of the best examples of that. He was able to pull off a miraculous comeback in Antarctica. I won't go into Shackleton's story, but this is like, this ad right here. It's like men wanted for hazardous journeys, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful honor and recognition in case of success, no guarantees. And he was able to put together the right crew. The stars aligned, and he had the right people on board. And everybody can pull it off when things go well. This right here, this was the Bowden-Perry expedition, Macmillan-Perry expedition to the North Pole. Again, the right guys for the right job. Now, in my career, oftentimes this is what I wound up with. It was a band of misfits. But just like Guardians of the Galaxy, everybody in that picture, they had skill sets which maybe weren't recognizable on the face of things, but at the right time and at the right moment, they came into play. And this is not necessarily how you want to plan your expeditions, but it's been how some really famous expeditions were able to be pulled off. Charles Darwin was 21 when he got on the HMS Beagle. He didn't know what he was doing. He was 21 years old. He said, I'm going to go around the world and I'm going to collect species, and I have this theory. And he really, to sell that, he couldn't sell that to the establishment. He had to bring people that were inexperienced and naive that said, sure, we'll give it a try. And of course, the rest, as they say, is history. Thor Heyerdahl for Kon-Tiki, if you're not familiar with that story, that's where Norwegian, I almost called him Swedish. That would have got me in trouble over in Scandinavia. But anyway, he decided to build a balsa wood raft to test a theory. And he brought scientists, guys that really weren't sailors, but had skills that weren't traditionally applicable to what he was trying to do, but turned out to be incredibly applicable. And of course, these three guys on the bottom right here, you're going to recognize them. Those are the Apollo 13 astronauts. Now, those guys, that crew was thrown together at the last moment. And it just was happenstance that they had the right skills at the right time to pull off a miracle. And of course, that was immortalized in the film with Tom Hanks, Gary Sinise, and God, I'm drawing a blank on the last actor there, but the other actor there, anyway. The other thing that I always like to say is that be creative and use what's available to you. I mean, this example right here is that's the motor yacht Latitude. That's the vessel that I brought through the Northwest Passage and punched up to the North Pole. Now, I'm going to explain this picture to you. We had to get creative because that boat was not ice classed, nor really was it the perfect boat to do the job. Now, the first time through the Northwest Passage, I was going through an area called the Bellot Strait, which is, imagine the Cape Cod Canal, but with super high, like canyon walls and ripping current that goes through there, eddies and rocks and all sorts of things. Now, picture that filled with ice. So I was going through, we waited outside of Fort Ross, which is on the east end of this channel. And we were waiting for an opportunity to get through the other side when it wasn't choked with ice. So we took our best shot. I would go out and scout every day with the tender and finally said, today's the day we're going to make an attempt to go through here. But when we were going through, we had ice that was coming at us at about 8 knots. Now, the hardest that I could hit ice with this boat was approximately 1.2 to 2 knots. 2 knots was a little, that would it definitely rang our bell when we would hit it. So in areas that were choked with ice, what I had to do was, again, I had to get creative. And what I would do would find an ice floe that was roughly the width of the vessel and wedge it between the bulbous bow, which you can notice, you see that big protrusion from the bow there. I would wedge that between the bulbous bow and the bow and use that as a battering ram. And then once it would disintegrate, and then I would find another one and was able to do that. And that was the same methodology that I used to punch up to the North Pole. When we made a run for the North Pole, the wind, the stars aligned, the wind had blown out of the north. So the polar ice cap opened up just enough that I was able to get up through all the cracks into the ice floe before we reached solid ice. And I used that same method because I had to be able to do 4 knots to get up to where I was going, to be able to turn around and get out safely before the wind started blowing south and the ice pack closed in. But the same is true with people, is that you have to look at the people that you have and use them creatively. Now, I first learned that right here on Cape Cod in Nantucket Sound. The first boat that I was given at 8 years old was a laser. And as you can see, I wasn't very good at it when I got it, but I got better. And I would to find other kids to go sailing with me. And oftentimes they weren't sailors, they were just other kids. And so, and it was, and I didn't realize it at the time, but every single one of them brought different skills to the table. Like one kid that had never been sailing, my friend is actually one of my best friends. He was a horse guy, but he really knew how to handle lines and he understood weight distribution. And I'd watch him move on board the boat. And again, that was an interesting way of looking at problems. I mean, we wiped the boat out a lot, but we got better at it. And that was the first experience I had with using people that really weren't tailor-made for the job, but turned out to be excellent at it. A boat called Blue Gold, that's a 162-foot stainless schooner I sailed throughout the South Pacific. I'm going to definitely tell you some stories about that further into the talk, because that was probably the pinnacle of definitely using what you have on hand. This boat, my Sienna, famous for below deck. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. Baraska, again, probably the most technically complicated vessel I used, and I had a very untested crew on board that boat. The first officer I had she was this little skinny English girl named Karen, and I made her my first officer. And she said to me, she goes, "I don't have any experience being a first officer, and I barely have any experience being a deckhand." But she had I could see the potential within her, and she turned out to be one of the best crews I ever had. And as her confidence grew, what we were able to do on board that boat also grew. And then finally, Brava Eugenia. That was the biggest vessel I ran. It was 397 feet. Literally walked on board the boat in Rotterdam with a completely untested crew of 33, where we then were able to get that boat out of the shipyard, bring it up to Norway, and pull off the very first successful charter that boat had. Now, what did I learn? Again, learn a lot of those skills. I went to Tabor Academy. I was on board the Tabor Boy, thrown in with a bunch of different guys, which really, few of them actually went on to become sailors. But we all had to cohese and become a crew that could successfully sail that vessel. During the summers, I worked at Highline Cruises. I got my first captain's license when I was 18. Every summer, we were put together with new crews, mostly kids from college doing an assortment for job. Even that guy right there. So worked with me on board a vessel, and he's seen it firsthand. A bunch of people that came together with really no maritime background, and yet were able to pull off bringing those boats safely in and out every day. And then my very first command, the motor vessel Patience, which was I was given at 18, which in retrospect was crazy. Why would they give an 18-year-old his own boat? But anyway, they did. Back to the motor vessel Blue Gold. I met the owner of this boat actually at a Starbucks in Manhattan. We were waiting in line to get coffee, and we just started chatting, and he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh," I says, "I'm a captain on super yachts." And he goes, "Well, I happen to own a super yacht." And he goes, "Are you looking for a job?" I said, "No, right, not right this second, but you never know." And he said to me, he goes, "I'm not looking for a captain, but you never know." Well, anyway, a couple months later, I was looking for a job, and he happened to be looking for a captain, and it worked out well. And off to the South Pacific I went. Now, there was a lot of craziness that went on with this particular vessel. I went to Vanuatu, which is an island chain 500 miles west of Fiji and 1,100 miles north of New Zealand. And I was handed a crew that was definitely thrown together. It was, this is how we landed right here. The girl in the necklace right there, Amy Leake, she was a local girl, a friend of my parents, and I called her up and was like, she had just graduated college. I said, "Hey, do you want to come to the South Pacific and work on a yacht?" She said, "Sure." The two people behind there, the guy in the white shirt and the blonde, they were the niece and boyfriend of the owner, who they came from a hotel background. The guy in the pink shirt, Poncho, I'll tell you a little bit about him in a second. He was my deckhand. And then my chef Lenny, who came from a hotel background, and then the two people behind me, my engineer, Sam. Sam actually did have a lot of experience in the yacht industry. He was one of the build engineers on a very famous vessel called the Maltese Falcon, because occasionally you do need people that actually do know how to do the job. We pulled off some amazing trips, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Poncho, the guy off to the left. And this is when you have a crew member or someone that isn't living up to their full potential, but maybe, but he was a hard worker, but he kept making mistakes. And I asked him, I was thinking to myself, I go, why does he keep messing up? And I thought, well, maybe he needs glasses. And then sure enough, he did need glasses. Now, what was interesting was culturally, he grew up very poor in the Philippines. And so the boat bought him a pair of glasses and he put them on, but he wasn't wearing them. And I said, "Why aren't you wearing them?" And he goes, "Oh, I don't want to ruin them, Cappy." And I said, "Well, you got to wear the glasses because that's the boat gave them to you so you could see." So we started wearing his glasses and his performance got a little bit better, but it still wasn't great. So I said to him, I thought to myself, well, maybe he's deaf. So I sent him to the doctor, and sure enough, got him hearing aids. But I had to get him to wear the hearing aids. And then he says, "I don't want to ruin him." I said, no, the boat bought him for you. You got to wear the hearing aids. So he's finally wearing his glasses, wearing his hearing aids, but it just turns out he just wasn't that bright. But that was the one thing that I couldn't fix. But my point was, sorry, Poncho, if you're watching this, but anyway, no, I love you. Anyway, but his work greatly improved. And that was sometimes I learned that you got a person that works hard, it's worth investing in them. And it's also worth finding out why they aren't living up to their full potential. And Poncho, again, he was instrumental for doing some amazing voyages in the South Pacific. And I couldn't have done what I did without him. He was really the backbone of that crew, was my bosun. And there we are under sail in the South Pacific. That was one of the things. We actually had blown out our mainsail on that. It literally exploded. Sounded like a cannon went off. And then Sam was able to rig up that spinnaker off the bow, because the show must go on. We continued sailing, and the passengers on board didn't miss a beat. That was a picture of the inside of a volcano that I took in Tana. I just threw that in there to kind of give you a feel for the wild of the South Pacific. It was really literally right out of a James Michener novel, Tales of the South Pacific, which was one of my inspirations for always wanting to travel there. And then finally, one last story. The gentleman that you see underneath the waterfall there, his name was Nixon. and he came from an island called Meagher. And he is the seventh son of the chief of Meagher, Chief Nelson. And Nelson named all his children after U.S. presidents. Nixon, obviously. Anyway, but what was interesting, out of an island nation, excuse me, not even an island nation, just a little island with villages with huts, Nixon's brothers became diplomats, doctors, architects. They were their circumstances and and where they came from did not stop them from really being successful. And not that you have to do those things to be successful, but Nelson his real focus was education. And whenever we would come to those islands, we would bring educational supplies. And a lot of the other chiefs would demand tribute, usually cash or rum. Rum was always a pretty good currency in the South Pacific, but not Nelson. Nelson always wanted, he goes, if you want to come and use the beaches and dive my reefs, bring me books and bring me things that I can educate my children with. And occasionally he liked frozen chicken wings, so we bring those to him as well. But again, Nixon became he worked with me on Blue Gold. He also worked with me on Latitude when I went back there as a guide, and he's went off to Maritime College and eventually got his Vanuatu captain's license. It doesn't matter where you come from. It just a matter of what you want to achieve, and Nixon definitely achieved that. On to motor yacht Latitude. Latitude was really the boat that I was known for and still am known for in our industry. That was a picture that we took in Greenland, that we were coming out of an area called Disco Bay. Disco Bay is on the east coast of Greenland, about halfway up, and it is where icebergs are born. Like those icebergs, some of them were about the size of the Cape Cod Mall. I actually saw an iceberg that looked like the Sydney Opera House actually do cartwheels around it. It was an amazing voyage. But the crew on board that boat was one of those times when the stars aligned. And these are the types of conditions that we were cruising in. And so how do you prepare for this? How do you find a crew that is ready for this type of cruising? Because frankly, nobody was. I wasn't. I'd never been in this type of heavy ice. I'd never been to Greenland. I certainly hadn't been through the Northwest Passage, considering that the first time we did it, we were the 216th boat in history. There weren't a lot of people that had been through with it. The charts were sketchy, and it was still one of the most wild, untamed places on the planet. So what type of crew do you pick? Well, you need a bunch of cowboys. And this was the first crew that I put on Latitude. It was one of those moments that one of those, again, those crews that the stars aligned. If you look off to the far right, you see the guy with the big mustache. That's Cliff Tweeden. Cliff, I spotted him when he was a deckhand on board this boat I ran called Ohana. He had literally come from Montana, where he was working on trucks and heavy equipment, and had never been on a boat before. But one of the hardest working guys I've ever met. He's still a dear friend of mine, and he eventually became the engineer on board Latitude. And when he became the engineer, I knew he was way out of his depth, that he had never seen a boat like Latitude before. He'd been an engineer on other boats. It wasn't completely, but it was a stretch for them. But I knew he wouldn't let me down. I don't even know if Cliff graduated high school. So it didn't matter to me. But because I knew intrinsically that he would never let me down, he would find a way to get the job done. And in the 5.5 years that we ran Latitude, we never had a single down day, ever, including in the Arctic. One time in the Arctic, our crane broke. And then he and our second engineer, who we'll talk about a little later on, managed to rebuild that crane with parts that we had on board and get us up and running and going. The boat was owned by the elderly, he'll kill me if I say that, the gray-haired gentleman Anil Fadani, who's one of the best, probably bar none, one of the best people I've ever worked for. It was Anil. I was an untested captain, and Anil truly let me off my leash when we were on latitude. A couple of the other people that I'll talk about later in there is Shelton and Haley. I'll introduce you to them in a second. Now, whoops. Fear is of the unknown was something that we always had, that was always prevalent, especially way up in the high latitudes. Polar bear attacks were a real thing. That really wasn't an actual polar bear attack. That was happened to be Cliff, who I just talked about, in a polar bear costume. But we were prepared. We had the right equipment. We had the right tools on board to deal with. Just because you have people that are unprepared doesn't mean, people that are untested doesn't mean that you can't prepare for all sorts of different contingencies. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Haley. So Haley was my chief stew. She was the second person that I hired. She had come from, she was from England. When she barely graduated in high school when she was over there. She never really fit in. Her parents were in the hospitality industry. She grew up in restaurants. And when she was in high school, she had a high school counselor that said the best that she was ever going to do was become a barista in a coffee shop. And when I hired Haley, I saw something in her that maybe she didn't see within herself. But one of the questions that I always ask of anybody when I'm hiring or when I'm interviewing someone, I say, what do you want to be? And they look at me like, well, what do you mean? And I said, let's forget about the interview. Do you want to be a concert pianist? Do you want to be an astronaut? What do you want to be? When you were a little kid, what did you want to do? And Haley told me, she said, I want to be a commercial pilot. And I said, well, I'm going to hold you to that. What do you need to do that? She goes, well, I need to get my pilot's license. I said, great. Now, if having a pilot on board these vessels that we do is always a plus. So when my goals aligned, or the organization's goals align with also your employees' goals, or in this case, our crew members' goals, then that's a win. But I've seen that the best thing for longevity is that when the organization also helps cultivate people in the organization's outside interests. I had a second stew that was an amazing artist, and that was great. So she used to make all the placemats and or like little place cards and draw all these really fun stuff for us. And she had this great artistic talent. And then the owner of Latitude's wife saw that as well. And together they produced a children's book. Together they produced a series of children's books. And because she could pursue her outside interest, her job performance on board the boat, of course, was excellent. And it was a great harmonious atmosphere. Now, Haley, this girl that was told that she would never be better than a barista, buckled down and studied, learned math, learned navigation, and then today she's a commercial pilot. And that was me flying with her in San Francisco. Wonderful, wonderful part of Latitude. One of my favorite crew. Now, this sullen-haired guy, right? This sullen guy in the middle right there, Rob. Rob came to me for an interview and sat across from me, and he was looking just depressed. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he goes, "Oh, I think my career is over." And I said, "What do you mean your career is over?" He says, "Well, I just failed my hearing and my colorblind test for this thing called an ENG1." And I said to him, "Well, you passed it before, and we're having a conversation right now." He's like, "I know." Because I don't know what happened. He goes, "But now I don't think I can get a job in the industry." And I said, "That's ridiculous." I said, "You come with me." Now, on his resume, I saw that he'd worked for a company called Fedship, which makes some of the finest yachts on the planet, as a master carpenter there. So I brought him on board the boat, handed him a wrench, gave him the cliff. I said, give him some jobs to see what he can do. Don't let him cut any wires, though. Anyway, and he performed exemplary. And then, sure enough, I found there was this little it was like a monocle. I found it in the marine stores for colorblind people to see what color running lights were. And I gave it to him. And then all of a sudden, he could see the different wires that he needed to cut. And the hearing never became an issue. And Rob was one of the most talented second engineers that I ever had. Rob, again, was like the first time that we took Latitude out, we got in horrendous seas, and we have these caps that were on the deck scuppers that actually, it was so rough, it blew the caps overboard. And then as over the next couple of months, I kept seeing the caps appearing, and they were custom made. And I thought, the heck, maybe we had a few extra left over. And I asked Rob, I said, Rob, where are we getting those caps, like in stainless, for all the deck drains? And he goes, oh, I'm making them. And he had handmade every single one of them on board the boat. Again, somebody who was incredibly talented. And he just needed the right tools to continue being talented. Now, the other guy in the background there with the off to the left in the green shirt with the hat, Shelton Dupree. He was my first officer on board Latitude. I've been blessed with fantastic first officers throughout my career, and Shelton was definitely one of them. Shelton today he was the one that put together The Highest Latitude, which is a film that I recommend you guys watch. It's on the Worth Avenue Yachts YouTube channel under a whole section called Dive In with Captain Sean. It's a 25-minute film that was edited by Shelton. Shelton used that as a springboard, and then today he films for the BBC, and currently he's working on Blue Planet. Again, I think Shelton graduated high school, but he was a surfer in South Africa. He split his time between South Africa and Canada, and that wasn't the right road for him. He's also got a 3,000-ton master's license, captain's license too. He's like smart guy, ambitious guy. All of the people that I worked with were smart and ambitious, and didn't necessarily fit into the education system that we had, but decided to go off and do it on their own. They weren't good in classrooms, but they were excellent under situations that normal people would buckle under. I mean, we worked with that first Northwest Passage. We were underway for 126 days straight through some of the most treacherous conditions I've ever seen anywhere on the planet, through ice, polar bears, charts, areas with no charts, you name it. That's a picture of myself, Cliff, Anil Thadani, and Ben, another one of our crew members, on that Kivoit Island. The first time that we did the Northwest Passage, we had a lot of naysayers saying that they got lucky. The second time we did it, we were the third boat in history to do that. We had less naysayers, and then when we punched up to the North Pole, the naysayers kind of turned around and said, well, geez, maybe they do know what they're doing. The fact is, we really didn't know what we were doing, but we got better at it every time that we did it. In times of adversity, explore. During that first Northwest Passage, we had limited charts, limited connectivity, and I actually had to, this was a chart that I was actually using. It was one of Admondson's original charts. The route that we were going to go through, which is through the Victoria Straits, was completely choked with ice. So we had to get creative and go through Admondson's original route, which we had limited charts to. And we were able to do that. That area right there, and then we punched in through that area right there was brand new. That area, when we came out on the other side, was completely choked with ice. We had to get creative and color outside of the lines, but we did it smart. When we went through that area, I didn't have charts. It was we put another boat in front of us, Franco, which is a deckhand I had from South Africa. He was completely untested, but I put him in the boat in front of us, told him to watch the depth sounder, and he was able to guide us through that. We didn't hit any rocks that were, because we didn't have any charts. So we were going to say uncharted rocks. Everything was uncharted. but we put him in front of us and he was able to guide us through. Again, he'd never done anything like that before. Today, Franco now is running his own vessel. And that's the type of stuff. This is the hero shot. This is the shot that you want. When we were coming back into London, after going through the Northwest Passage for a second time, and we made it home. This is what makes it all worthwhile. I've thrown in a picture of polar bears because they're cute and everyone wants to see polar bears. So, that was a picture taken by John Isaac, who was a famous wildlife photographer that was with us on the first Northwest Passage. So how does a crew become from that group of cowboys to this group right here, standing at the north at 81 degrees 25 on top of the world? It goes through that. You get there by recognizing talents in people that they don't necessarily recognize in themselves, and then giving them everything they need to succeed, and not berating them when they don't, but just making sure that they learn from those mistakes. Now, everyone says, well, wait a minute, weren't you on below deck? And yes, I was on below deck. I was on for an episode and a half. Had I been on for a little bit longer, I would have there was great potential in that crew. I don't think I was asked back because maybe there weren't enough shenanigans that happened while I was on board that particular boat. But I'll tell you, is that the crew that I had a great, I had a great Chief Stew. She got a little bit of a bad rap towards the end of the trip. I had a great second Stu Frazier. He actually got asked back onto the show. And of course I had Eddie the bosun, who was my first officer, who's a captain of a tug in Baltimore Harbor. There was some talent on board that vessel. And what I want to do on the show is say, what if, rather than focusing on all the craziness and all the shenanigans, what if we focused on the skills that these people had to get where they needed to be on that vessel and on board that show? And there was a glimpse when they were cohesing and they were coming together. And had I been on for the rest of the episodes, who knows what would have happened? I'm sure a few shenanigans would have happened, but it might have been a different television show. Anyway, my Sienna was probably one of my most successful charter vessels. And I'm going to leave you with just the one final story. And it's not necessarily about the effect that these voyages have on the crews, because again, I've had successful crews and they've gone off and done amazing things and been successful in their own right. But primarily we were bringing charters guests and owners into these environmental areas and into these sensitive areas, and the effect that has on when you bring people into these places, what does it have on them? One story in particular is that I did a charter on board my Sienna. We were in Europe, and we had this big gentleman on board, and he was a big gruff guy, and we're about 3 days into the charter, and I asked him, I said, is there everything okay? Can we do anything better? And he goes, oh, it's not you. I said, well, what's wrong then? He says, I own the largest car factory in the world. And when I get home, I have to lay off 20,000 people. And it weighed on him because he felt responsible for these people. Well, anyway, we continued on with the vacation. And I found what most people want when they chartered vessels, at least with me, was not sip champagne in Saint-Tropez and be wild and partying, but it was to reconnect with their families, because they're in such high pressure jobs and they work 100 hours a week that they don't get to see their kids and they don't get to see their wives. And then if they can be with them for 2 weeks, they want to maximize that time. And that's what we were able to do. And we made it fun. We set up all sorts of just crazy games, and we had this band come on board And it was a wonderful, wonderful charter. And at the end of that charter, we're pulling back into port, and he was sitting up in the pilot house with me, and he says, I think I figured out a way to keep those people employed. And in this industry, I used to joke, it's not like we're curing cancer. But at that particular moment, I changed my tune. I said, we may not be curing cancer of the body, but we were certainly curing cancer of the mind. And this guy, by just de-escalating his life and taking his stress level down, he was able to think clearly. And when you do that to the 1% of the 1%, magical things happen. This guy was responsible for over 300,000 employees, and by thinking clearly, he was able to save 20,000 jobs. And that was the real power that these voyages have. They have a transformative effect, not only on the crew that is there because they're growing and learning, but also the guests see that transformation as well. And they think, geez, how can I grow and how can I learn? I've seen people that have gone into environmentally sensitive areas and have seen polar bears that were starving to death and thought, how can I change things in my company? They've seen people with rivers that were choked with plastic and go, how can I change things in my company, or how can I spread the word? Anytime that you do a good deed, no matter how small or how minor, has a ripple effect. And what I've been so fortunate to be is involved in significant voyages with extraordinary people on both sides, extraordinary crew and extraordinary guests. And I am extremely lucky to have that and have had the accolades that have come with that. But with that, there's always a come down at the end. I love Tom Brady. Tom Brady, after winning 6 Super Bowls with the Patriots, could have walked away, but no, he went to Tampa and he won one more. And then after he won that, we saw him on Fox. He's always great about moving that goalpost and challenging himself. And that's what I'd like to continually do today. Today, I don't do as much boating as I used to, but I try to get out there and I try to talk about change and the transformative effects that just being on the water, and that just by treating people nice and giving people what they need to succeed has really been my passion today. Anyway, thank you very much. Any questions that you may have, I'm happy to take.